Picture rain falling on the Thames in the early morning hours of June 18, 1982. The sound of water drops hitting the river's surface, mixing with the gentle lapping of waves against the stone pillars of Blackfriars Bridge. A postal clerk named Gordon Payne is walking to work, his footsteps echoing on the wet pavement. He glances down at the muddy bank below and sees something that will haunt him for the rest of his life. A man is hanging from scaffolding beneath the bridge, suspended by an orange rope tied around his neck. The man is wearing an expensive gray suit, now soaked through from the rain. His pockets are stuffed with bricks and stones, weighing him down. In those pockets, police will find nearly $15,000 in various currencies, all carefully arranged. The man's hands show no signs of struggle. His expensive watch is still ticking on his wrist. Everything about the scene is wrong, methodically wrong, as if someone wanted to send a message that only certain people would understand. The dead man is Roberto Calvi, chairman of Italy's largest private bank. He is known as God's banker because of his deep connections to the Vatican. And his death beneath Blackfriars Bridge will open a door into a world of secrets that powerful people would kill to keep hidden. This is not just a murder mystery. This is a story about how money, religion, and power became so entangled that telling where one ends and another begins became impossible. Let the rain sounds carry you deeper into the story as we unravel what really happened to the man they called God's banker. Roberto Calvi was born in Milan in 1920, the son of a bank manager. From childhood, he understood the language of money, the quiet conversations in offices where futures were decided, where fortunes were made and lost with a signature. He was methodical, precise, the kind of man who measured everything twice before making a move. By 1947, he had joined Banco Ambrosiano, a Catholic bank with deep ties to the Vatican. The bank's name came from Saint Ambrose, the patron saint of Milan, and it prided itself on serving the faithful. But Calvi saw something more in Banco Ambrosiano. He saw potential, connections, opportunities that most people would never notice. He rose steadily through the ranks, never making enemies, always being useful to the right people. By 1975, he was chairman, the most powerful banker in Italy. But Calvi's genius wasn't just in traditional banking. He understood something that few others did in those years. He understood that money needed to move in shadows sometimes, that there were people and organizations who needed financial services that couldn't be traced, transactions that couldn't be questioned. He built a network of shell companies in tax havens, a labyrinth of accounts and transfers that even expert accountants struggled to follow. And he made himself indispensable to powerful institutions, particularly one institution that had more secrets than any other. The Vatican Bank, officially known as the Institute for the Works of Religion, needed someone who understood how to move money discreetly. And Roberto Calvi became their man. The partnership that would eventually lead to his death beneath a London bridge was beginning to form. Let the rain continue in the background as we explore how a banker from Milan became intertwined with the Roman Catholic Church. The Vatican Bank is unlike any other financial institution in the world. It operates without transparency, answering to no regulatory body, hidden behind centuries of tradition and religious authority. In the 1970s, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus ran the Vatican Bank. He was an American from Chicago, a large man with a practical approach to finance. He understood that the church needed money to operate its global mission, and he wasn't squeamish about where that money came from or how it was managed. Calvi and Marcinkus found each other. The banker who knew how to move money invisibly and the archbishop who needed money moved. Together, they created something unprecedented. Banco Ambrosiano became the Vatican Bank's main conduit for international transactions. Calvi would take deposits from the Vatican, funnel them through his network of shell companies, and return them cleaned, multiplied, untraceable. It was a perfect arrangement for everyone involved. The Vatican got financial growth without scrutiny. Calvi got power and the protection of the church. But there were others in this arrangement, silent partners who stayed in the shadows. Calvi was also moving money for less holy purposes. The Sicilian mafia needed ways to launder drug money. Political parties needed secret funding that couldn't appear on official records. Intelligence agencies from various countries needed untraceable accounts for covert operations. And there were whispers of an organization called Propaganda Do, or P2, a secret Masonic lodge that had infiltrated the highest levels of Italian government, business, and military. Calvi was their banker too. He was everyone's banker, and that made him the most dangerous man in Italy, because he knew everything. Every secret transaction, every hidden account, every illegal deal. And as long as he stayed loyal and kept quiet, he was protected. But if he ever decided to talk, or if he became a liability, well, that's when things would become complicated. By 1981, the carefully constructed world Roberto Calvi had built was beginning to crack. Italian investigators had started looking into Banco Ambrosiano's international dealings. They couldn't quite understand the complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts, but they knew something wasn't right. The numbers didn't add up. Money was disappearing into foreign subsidiaries that seemed to exist only on paper. Calvi was called to testify. He was calm, professional, giving answers that sounded reasonable but explained nothing. He had decades of practice making complicated financial arrangements seem legitimate. But the pressure was building. In July 1981, Calvi was arrested for illegal currency exportation. It was a minor charge, really just a crack in the facade. But it was enough. He spent time in jail, and during those weeks behind bars, something changed in Roberto Calvi. People who knew him said he became paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder, jumping at unexpected sounds. He started carrying a pistol. He hired bodyguards. He would check his car for bombs before getting in each morning. His family noticed the change. His wife Clara said he wasn't sleeping, that he would wake in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, muttering about people who were after him. His daughter said he seemed like a man who knew too much and was terrified of what would happen when others found out. Calvi was convicted in 1981 and sentenced to 4 years in prison. But he appealed and remained free while the case moved through Italy's slow judicial system. During this time, investigators were digging deeper into Banco Ambrosiano's finances, and what they were finding was catastrophic. The bank was missing over $1 billion. It had been hidden through Calvi's network of shell companies, but now that network was being exposed. The money was gone, lost in a maze of fraudulent transactions and bad loans. And the people who had trusted Calvi with their secrets, with their dirty money, were realizing that he might not be able to protect them anymore. Listen to the rain and understand that some organizations operate entirely in shadows, and P2 was one of the darkest. Propaganda Do was officially a Masonic lodge, but it was something far more sinister. Founded and led by Licio Gelli, a fascist sympathizer with connections to everyone from Italian politicians to South American dictators, P2 had infiltrated Italian society at every level. Members included cabinet ministers, military generals, intelligence chiefs, journalists, and businessmen. They had a plan, documented in papers later seized by police, to effectively take over the Italian government through a combination of corruption, blackmail, and strategic violence. Roberto Calvi was a member of P2. More than that, he was their banker. He moved money for them, hid their transactions, made their corruption financially possible. But being P2's banker meant owing loyalty to Licio Gelli, and Gelli was not a man who tolerated failure or betrayal. As the investigation into Banco Ambrosiano intensified, P2's secrets were at risk of exposure. The lodge's membership list was discovered by police in 1981, causing a massive scandal. Government ministers resigned. Military officers were arrested. The entire organization was supposedly disbanded. But everyone knew that P2 hadn't really gone away. It had just gone deeper underground. And now their banker, the man who knew where all the money had gone and who it had gone to, was in trouble. Calvi started receiving threats. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. Cars following him through the streets of Milan. Strange men watching his house. He told his family he was being pressured to stay quiet, to take full responsibility for Banco Ambrosiano's collapse and not implicate anyone else. The message was clear. Go to prison quietly, do your time, and when you get out, you'll be taken care of. But if you talk, if you name names, if you expose what's really been happening, then you won't live long enough to testify. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments, because I love knowing that people all over the world are discovering these stories. And if you're finding this helpful for sleep or just fascinated by this case, please subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Now let's continue with the Rain and Roberto Calvi's final days. By June 1982, Roberto Calvi knew he was running out of time. The investigation had revealed that Banco Ambrosiano was essentially bankrupt, missing over $1.3 billion. The Bank of Italy was preparing to take control of the institution. Criminal charges were inevitable, and the people Calvi had served, whose secrets he had protected for decades, were making it clear that they couldn't let him be interrogated by prosecutors. On June 10, 1982, Calvi made his decision. He would run. Using a false passport under the name John Roberto Calvini, he fled Italy. He left behind his wife Clara, his daughter Anna, his son Carlo. He told them he needed to get away, to find evidence that would prove he'd been acting under orders from higher powers, that he'd been following instructions from the Vatican Bank and other institutions. He promised he would clear his name and return. His journey was strange and circuitous. First to Austria, then to London, moving through a network of safe houses and hotels, never staying in one place for long. He was accompanied by a small group of people, though their exact identities and loyalties remain unclear to this day. Some say they were helping him. Others believe they were escorting him to his death. In London, Calvi stayed in a modest apartment in Chelsea. He made phone calls, dozens of them, trying to reach people who might help him. He called the Vatican, begging for Archbishop Marcinkus to intervene, to publicly acknowledge that he'd been acting on the Church's behalf. Those calls went unreturned. He called Italian politicians who owed him favors. They wouldn't take his calls. He called members of P2. They told him to stay quiet and wait for instructions. He was alone now, abandoned by everyone he'd served. The protection he thought he'd earned through decades of service had evaporated. And in those final days in London, Roberto Calvi must have realized that he'd become a liability that needed to be eliminated. On the evening of June 17, 1982, Roberto Calvi made a final phone call to his daughter Anna back in Italy. His voice on that call, which was recorded by investigators who were monitoring the Calvi family, reveals a man who knew he was in mortal danger. He told Anna that he was afraid, that people were following him, that he didn't know who to trust anymore. He said he had documents that would expose everything, that would prove he'd been following orders, that would bring down powerful people in the Vatican, in P2, in the Italian government. He told her he was going to meet someone that night who might be able to help him. He didn't say who. He promised to call her the next day. He never did. What happened in the hours between that phone call and when Roberto Calvi's body was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge has been debated for decades. The official story, the one initially accepted by British police, was suicide. They said Calvi, facing financial ruin and criminal prosecution, had taken his own life. He'd somehow obtained bricks and stones, stuffed them in his pockets, climbed down scaffolding beneath the bridge in the middle of the night, and hanged himself. But nothing about that story made sense. Calvi was terrified of heights. Multiple witnesses confirmed he couldn't even stand on a balcony without feeling dizzy. The idea that he'd voluntarily climbed down scaffolding in the dark was absurd. The bricks in his pockets were arranged too carefully, almost ritually. The amount of money found on his body, exactly divided between different currencies, seemed symbolic rather than random. And forensic experts would later point out that there were no marks on his hands consistent with climbing down scaffolding, no dirt under his fingernails, no defensive wounds of any kind. Roberto Calvi didn't commit suicide beneath Blackfriars Bridge. Someone put him there. Someone wanted his death to look a certain way, to send a specific message. But to understand that message, you need to understand the symbolism of the location. Let the rain sounds continue as we explore why Blackfriars Bridge matters so much in this story. In Masonic tradition, Blackfriars are brothers who have betrayed the lodge. They're marked men, traitors who must be punished. The choice of Blackfriars Bridge as the location for Roberto Calvi's body was not accidental. It was a message as clear as a signed confession to those who understood the code. The bricks in his pockets, the scaffolding, the position of the body, all of it had Masonic symbolism. In Masonic ritual, betrayal is punished through symbolic executions that mirror the crime. A brother who steals from the lodge might be found with money in his pockets. A brother who builds a fortune on lies might be found among construction materials. Roberto Calvi had betrayed P2. Whether intentionally or simply by becoming a liability, he'd put the organization at risk. His arrest, his threatened cooperation with investigators, his possession of documents that could expose members, all of this made him a Blackfriar in their eyes. And the punishment for that betrayal had to be public enough to be seen, symbolic enough to be understood by other potential traitors, yet mysterious enough that authorities couldn't easily prove what had happened. Licio Gelli, the head of P2, had fled to Switzerland by the time Calvi died. But his organization still operated. They still had members in positions of power. They still had resources and reach. And they had connections to groups that specialized in making problems disappear. The Sicilian Mafia had used Calvi's banking network. They'd lost money when Banco Ambrosiano collapsed. They had their own reasons to want him dead. And they had the skills to carry out a killing that would look like suicide to casual observers but would be understood as murder by those who needed to understand it. British police initially treated Roberto Calvi's death as suicide. It seemed straightforward to them, a desperate man taking his own life. But the Italian authorities immediately suspected murder. They'd been investigating Calvi for months. They knew about his connections to organized crime, to P2, to the Vatican Bank. They knew he'd been receiving death threats. The Calvi family hired private investigators and forensic experts. They commissioned independent autopsies. And slowly, methodically, evidence began to emerge that contradicted the suicide theory. Calvi's body showed traces of paint that matched the color of a boat, suggesting he'd been transported to the bridge by water, not that he'd walked there. His lungs contained no water, meaning he hadn't been breathing when his body entered the Thames. He was already dead when he was hanged. The angle of the rope around his neck was inconsistent with suicide by hanging. It was more consistent with strangulation followed by staging. Timeline analysis showed it would have been nearly impossible for Calvi to reach that location and position himself in that way in the time available. Witnesses came forward saying they'd seen a group of men near Blackfriars Bridge on the night in question, carrying something heavy. But despite this accumulating evidence, the British investigation moved slowly, hampered by jurisdictional issues and the sheer complexity of the case. This wasn't just a murder. This was international conspiracy involving multiple countries, organized crime, Masonic lodges, and the Vatican. The deeper investigators dug, the more powerful the people they found. And powerful people have ways of making investigations stall. Years would pass. Decades would pass. And the full truth of what happened to Roberto Calvi would remain stubbornly out of reach, protected by layers of secrecy and the selective amnesia of those who knew what really happened that night beneath Blackfriars Bridge. One of the most damning aspects of the Roberto Calvi case is the Vatican's response, or rather, their lack of response. When Calvi died, the Vatican Bank was exposed as deeply involved in Banco Ambrosiano's fraudulent activities. Documents showed that Archbishop Marcinkus had co-signed letters that effectively guaranteed Banco Ambrosiano's loans to shell companies. These letters made it appear that the Vatican Bank was backing these transactions, giving them legitimacy they didn't deserve. When Banco Ambrosiano collapsed, creditors demanded that the Vatican honor these guarantees. The Church initially refused, claiming the letters were forgeries or that Marcinkus had exceeded his authority. But eventually, facing intense pressure and the threat of massive lawsuits, the Vatican agreed to pay $244 million to Banco Ambrosiano's creditors without admitting any wrongdoing. It was one of the largest financial settlements in Vatican history, a tacit admission that they'd been involved in Calvi's schemes even if they wouldn't say so publicly. But what the Vatican never did was cooperate with the murder investigation. Archbishop Marcinkus refused to testify. The Vatican claimed diplomatic immunity, pointing out that Vatican City is a sovereign state and its officials can't be compelled to appear in Italian or British courts. Marcinkus remained safe behind Vatican walls until the statute of limitations on related charges expired. He eventually left Vatican Bank leadership but never faced any criminal prosecution. He died in 2006, taking whatever he knew about Roberto Calvi and their financial arrangements to his grave. The Vatican's silence spoke volumes. If Calvi had truly been acting alone, if the Church had been an innocent victim of his fraud, they would have been eager to cooperate with investigators to expose him. Instead, they circled the wagons, protected their officials, and paid whatever was necessary to make the problem go away. This behavior suggested that Roberto Calvi had indeed been acting with Vatican knowledge and approval, that he'd been doing exactly what Church officials wanted him to do. And when he became a liability, when his arrest threatened to expose their involvement, they cut all ties and let him face the consequences alone. Make sure you're subscribed because this story gets even more complex. Hit that like button and turn on notifications. Let the rain continue as we dive deeper into the conspiracy that killed God's banker. While P2 and the Vatican had reasons to want Calvi dead, the Sicilian Mafia had perhaps the most concrete motive. In the years before his death, Roberto Calvi had moved hundreds of millions of dollars for mafia families through his network of shell companies. This wasn't just money laundering in the traditional sense. Calvi was investing mafia money in legitimate businesses, real estate, and financial instruments, helping to transform drug profits into clean capital. The arrangement worked well until Banco Ambrosiano's collapse. When the bank went under, mafia money went with it. Hundreds of millions of dollars simply vanished into the maze of bankrupt shell companies and uncollectible loans. The families who had entrusted their money to Calvi wanted it back, and they wanted answers about where it had gone. Francesco Di Carlo, a Sicilian mafioso who later became an informant, claimed he was present at meetings where Calvi's fate was discussed. According to Di Carlo, the decision to kill Calvi was made by a consortium of interests, mafia families, yes, but also members of P2, and with tacit approval from certain Vatican officials who wanted to ensure Calvi could never testify about their involvement in his schemes. Di Carlo said the actual killing was carried out by mafia hitmen who specialized in making murders look like accidents or suicides. They'd flown to London, grabbed Calvi from his apartment, likely drugged him to keep him docile, took him by boat down the Thames to Blackfriars Bridge, strangled him, and then staged the scene to send the message about Masonic betrayal while also creating enough ambiguity that police might rule it suicide. The plan had worked, at least initially, but Di Carlo's testimony, given years later, couldn't be fully corroborated. He knew details about the killing that hadn't been made public, suggesting he had insider knowledge. But he also had reasons to lie, to exaggerate his importance, to tell investigators what they wanted to hear in exchange for protection and reduced sentences on his own crimes. Still, his account matched what forensic evidence suggested, that Calvi had been killed elsewhere and his body positioned beneath the bridge, that multiple people were involved, that the murder was professional, planned, symbolic, and that the people who ordered it had connections that reached from the streets of Sicily to the halls of Vatican City. Licio Gelli deserves his own chapter in this story because understanding him is essential to understanding what happened to Roberto Calvi. Born in 1919, Gelli had lived through fascist Italy, had connections to Mussolini's regime, and after World War II had somehow transformed himself into a respected businessman despite his fascist past. But Gelli's real power came from P2, which he transformed from a traditional Masonic lodge into something far more sinister, a shadow government within Italy. His membership list read like a who's who of Italian power. 3 cabinet ministers, 43 members of parliament, 43 generals and admirals, hundreds of senior civil servants, industrialists, magistrates, and journalists. With these connections, Gelli could influence virtually any aspect of Italian life. He could shape media coverage, direct police investigations, influence judicial decisions, and manipulate political processes. He was the puppet master, and Italy was his theater. Roberto Calvi had been recruited into P2 in the early 1970s. Gelli recognized that controlling Italy's finances was crucial to controlling Italy itself. With Calvi managing Banco Ambrosiano and the Vatican Bank connection, P2 had access to unlimited funds that could be moved invisibly around the world. But when Banco Ambrosiano began to collapse, Jelly's position became precarious. The P2 membership list had already been exposed in 1981. He'd fled to Switzerland and then to South America, evading arrest. But his organization still operated, and it still needed to protect its secrets. Calvi had been Jelly's banker, but he'd also been present at P2 meetings. He knew who the members were. He knew what they'd discussed. He knew about plans that had never been implemented, crimes that had never been officially linked to the lodge, corruption that had never been exposed. And now he was in the custody of police, facing the prospect of long prison sentences unless he cooperated and provided information about his accomplices. From Jelly's perspective, Calvi had become an existential threat. He couldn't be allowed to testify. He couldn't be allowed to trade information for leniency. He had to be silenced permanently. One of the enduring mysteries of the Calvi case involves the people who accompanied him during his final days in London. Calvi hadn't traveled alone. Several individuals were with him at various points, helping him move between safe houses, arranging meetings, supposedly working to help him escape or find evidence to clear his name. But who were these people really? And were they helping him or leading him to his death? One name that emerged during investigations was Flavio Carboni, a Sardinian businessman with connections to both legitimate commerce and organized crime. Carboni had befriended Calvi in the months before his death, supposedly offering to help him navigate his legal troubles. Carboni was in London when Calvi died. He helped arrange Calvi's false passport. He knew where Calvi was staying, and according to some witnesses, he was one of the last people to see Calvi alive. When questioned, Carboni claimed he'd been trying to help Calvi escape and find documents that would prove his innocence. He said he left Calvi at the Chelsea apartment on the night of June 17th and knew nothing about what happened after that. But investigators suspected Carboni was actually working for interests that wanted Calvi dead, that he'd gained Calvi's trust specifically to position him for assassination, that everything about the escape plan had been a setup from the start. Also present in London was Silvano Vitter, Carboni's associate, and there was mention of other shadowy figures, people whose identities were never fully established, who seemed to appear and disappear from the story at convenient moments. Were these people mafia contractors, P2 operatives, intelligence agents? The question of who actually carried out the killing has never been definitively answered. But what seems clear is that Roberto Calvi didn't realize he was being escorted to his execution. He thought he was running to safety. Instead, he was being delivered to the people who wanted him dead. It would take years for anyone to be charged with Roberto Calvi's murder. In 1991, nearly a decade after the death, the official verdict was finally changed from suicide to murder. This was largely due to the persistence of Calvi's family and their lawyers, who never accepted the suicide theory and continued to push for investigation. But charging someone with the murder proved incredibly difficult. The crime had occurred in London, but the conspirators were in Italy and elsewhere. Witnesses were scarce or unreliable. Physical evidence was limited, and the people suspected of ordering or carrying out the killing had powerful connections and expensive lawyers. In 2005, more than 2 decades after Calvi's death, a trial finally took place in Rome. 5 defendants were charged with murder: Flavio Carboni, Carboni's girlfriend Manuela Kleinzig, mafia financier Ernesto Diotolivi, Sardinian businessman Silvano Vitter, and mafia boss Giuseppe Callo. The prosecution argued that these individuals had conspired to kill Calvi because of money he owed to mafia families and because of the risk he posed as someone who knew too much about criminal operations involving P2, the mafia, and the Vatican Bank. The trial revealed disturbing details about the conspiracy. Witnesses testified about meetings where Calvi's death was discussed. Phone records showed suspicious calls between defendants around the time of the murder. Financial records revealed payments that might have been for hiring killers, but proving beyond reasonable doubt that these specific individuals had carried out or ordered this specific murder was nearly impossible given the passage of time and the complexity of the conspiracy. In June 2007, all 5 defendants were acquitted due to insufficient evidence. The judge acknowledged that Calvi had almost certainly been murdered as part of a conspiracy involving multiple parties, but said the evidence wasn't strong enough to convict these particular defendants. The Calvi family was devastated. After 25 years of fighting for justice, the people they believed had killed their husband and father walked free. Roberto Calvi's murder remains officially unsolved to this day. In the wake of the Banco Ambrosiano scandal and Roberto Calvi's death, the Vatican was forced to confront its financial practices. The relationship with Calvi had exposed the Vatican Bank to international scrutiny and criticism. The Church's finances, which had operated for centuries with virtually no transparency, were suddenly subject to questions from regulators, prosecutors, and the public. The Vatican implemented reforms throughout the 1980s and 1990s. They brought in outside auditors. They agreed to cooperate with some international financial regulations. They promised greater transparency in their operations. But critics argued these reforms were largely cosmetic. The Vatican Bank continued to operate with far less oversight than any other financial institution of comparable size. It still held accounts for suspicious individuals and organizations. It still facilitated transactions that couldn't be traced. Archbishop Marcinkus was quietly moved out of Vatican Bank leadership in 1989, but he faced no punishment for his role in the Banco Ambrosiano affair. He returned to the United States and lived comfortably until his death in 2006, protected by Vatican immunity from ever having to testify about his dealings with Roberto Calvi. The question that haunts this case is simple. What did Vatican officials know about Calvi's activities, and when did they know it? Were they active participants in money laundering and fraud, or were they naive victims of a clever banker? The evidence strongly suggests the former. The Vatican Bank wasn't just a client of Calvi's schemes. It was a partner. Church officials knew money was being moved through questionable channels. They knew Calvi was dealing with unsavory characters. They knew his network of shell companies existed specifically to hide money and evade regulations. And they continued working with him because it was profitable for the church, because it allowed them to grow their financial holdings without the transparency that would have come from using legitimate banking channels. When Calvi became a liability, when his arrest threatened to expose their involvement, the Vatican cut him loose. They didn't help him escape. They didn't provide lawyers. They didn't acknowledge their partnership. They let him die alone beneath Blackfriars Bridge, and then they paid a settlement to make the scandal go away without ever admitting what they'd really been doing. Whenever a case involves powerful institutions, organized crime, and an unsolved murder, conspiracy theories multiply. The Roberto Calvi affair has inspired dozens of theories, some plausible, others fantastical. One theory suggests that Calvi wasn't killed because of money or to prevent him from testifying. Instead, he was killed because he discovered something even more dangerous: secret financial connections between the Vatican and intelligence agencies during the Cold War. According to this theory, the Vatican Bank was being used by the CIA and other Western intelligence services to funnel money to anti-communist groups in Eastern Europe and Latin America, and Calvi had stumbled onto evidence of these operations. Another theory proposes that Calvi's death was actually ordered by shadowy international banking interests who saw him as a threat to the emerging global financial system. His network of unregulated offshore accounts and shell companies was an early version of what would later become common practice, but in the early 1980s, traditional banks saw this as competition that needed to be eliminated. Some researchers have suggested connections to the attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II in 1981. They point out that the gunman, Mehmet Ali Agca, had connections to organized crime groups that also used Calvi's banking services. They theorized that the same conspiracy that tried to kill the Pope might have eventually killed Calvi to cover up the financial trail. There are even theories that involve Cold War politics at the highest level, suggesting that Calvi's death was approved or even arranged by intelligence services who needed to protect secrets about how the West funded anti-communist operations. These theories are difficult to prove or disprove because they involve organizations and individuals who operate in secrecy. Intelligence agencies don't release files about operations from the 1980s. The Vatican doesn't open its archives. Organized crime families don't publish their financial records. What we're left with is fragments of information, testimony from people with questionable motives, documents that raise more questions than they answer, and a body of evidence that suggests a massive conspiracy but can't quite prove exactly who was involved or why. After fleeing Italy in 1981, Licio Gelli, the Grand Master of P2, lived as a fugitive for years. He moved between Switzerland, Uruguay, and other countries that didn't have strong extradition treaties with Italy. But eventually, in 1987, he was arrested in Switzerland while trying to withdraw money from a Swiss bank account. He was carrying a false passport and had attempted to disguise his appearance. Swiss authorities prepared to extradite him to Italy, where he faced charges related to the Banco Ambrosiano fraud and his role in P2's illegal activities. But in a twist that seemed almost too perfect, Gelli escaped from Swiss custody. He managed to get out of his prison hospital room, despite being 68 years old and under guard, and fled to South America. He lived freely in Uruguay for several years, apparently protected by connections he'd built over decades of international intrigue. Finally, in 1998, Italian commandos working with French police captured Gelli at Nice airport. He was brought back to Italy to finally face justice for his role in the greatest political and financial scandal in modern Italian history. But Gelli's trials were complicated affairs. He faced multiple charges: conspiracy, fraud, involvement in terrorist activities, and more. Some charges resulted in convictions, others in acquittals. He spent time in prison but was often released on appeal or for health reasons. The man who had once controlled a secret government within Italy, who had connections to everyone from mafia bosses to Vatican officials to South American dictators, ended up serving relatively little prison time. He remained defiant to the end, insisting that P2 had been patriots trying to save Italy from communism, that everything they'd done had been justified by the political situation of the time. Licio Gelli died in 2015 at the age of 96. To the end, he never fully explained his relationship with Roberto Calvi, never admitted to ordering or approving the banker's death, never revealed all the secrets of P2's activities during those years. Whatever he knew about what really happened beneath Blackfriars Bridge died with him. One more voice that could have explained this mystery choosing instead to stay silent. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. Turn on notifications for more deep dives into historical mysteries and true crime. Let the rain carry you through the final chapters of God's banker's story. For Roberto Calvi's widow Clara and his children, Anna and Carlo, the years after his death became consumed with seeking justice and clearing his name. They never accepted the suicide verdict. They knew Roberto, knew his fears, knew he'd been running from people who wanted him dead. The family hired investigators, forensic experts, lawyers, anyone who might help prove what they already knew: that Roberto had been murdered. Clara Calvi spent years traveling between Italy and London, meeting with police, providing documents, pushing for the investigation to continue. She faced skepticism and resistance. Many authorities seemed content to let the case remain closed as suicide. Reopening it would mean confronting powerful institutions and people who didn't want to be confronted. Anna Calvi became particularly outspoken about the case. She gave interviews, appeared in documentaries, wrote articles about her father. She argued that he'd been a scapegoat, blamed for crimes that had actually been committed by or on behalf of far more powerful people. She maintained that if Roberto had been allowed to testify, if he'd been protected instead of abandoned, he could have exposed corruption that reached into the highest levels of Italian society and the Vatican itself. The family's persistence eventually paid off. In 1991, the official verdict was changed from suicide to murder. In 2002, Calvi's body was exhumed for new forensic tests, which confirmed what the family had always believed. He'd been killed before being hung beneath the bridge. But the 2007 acquittal of all defendants in the murder trial was a devastating blow. After 25 years of fighting, the people they believed responsible walked free. Clara Calvi died in 2010, never having seen anyone convicted for her husband's murder. Her children continue to speak about the case, to share documents, to keep public attention focused on the unsolved crime. They've pursued their quest not just for justice, but to restore Roberto Calvi's reputation. In their eyes, he wasn't the criminal mastermind the media portrayed. He was a banker who'd gotten caught up in systems of corruption far larger than himself, who'd served powerful interests, and who'd been sacrificed when he became inconvenient. Whether that's the full truth or a family's natural desire to see their father in the best light possible is something each person must decide for themselves. But their dedication to seeking answers, their refusal to accept easy explanations, their persistence in the face of institutional resistance, all of this has kept the case alive in public consciousness and has gradually revealed more about the conspiracy that killed Roberto Calvi. The Roberto Calvi case changed how we understand the intersection of finance, religion, and organized crime. It exposed the Vatican Bank's willingness to engage in questionable financial practices. It revealed how easily money could be laundered through networks of shell companies in the pre-internet era. It showed how secret societies like P2 could infiltrate democratic governments. And it demonstrated how difficult it is to investigate and prosecute conspiracies that involve powerful institutions with resources and connections that span multiple countries. The case influenced Italian politics for decades. The P2 scandal led to reforms in how Masonic lodges are regulated. The Banco Ambrosiano collapse led to stricter banking regulations. The Vatican's involvement forced the Church to implement financial reforms it had resisted for centuries. But beyond the institutional changes, the case left behind questions that remain relevant today. How much secret power do unelected officials in religious institutions wield? How can we prevent banking systems from being used for money laundering and fraud when financial transactions have become so complex that even experts struggle to track them? How do we investigate crimes when the criminals have connections at the highest levels of government and law enforcement? The term God's banker became shorthand for the dangerous mixing of religious authority and financial power. It represented how institutions we're taught to trust can be deeply compromised, how money corrupts even supposedly holy endeavors, how secrecy enables abuse. Roberto Calvi's life and death serve as a warning about what happens when financial systems operate without transparency, when religious institutions prioritize their wealth over their stated values, when criminal organizations are allowed to infiltrate legitimate businesses and governments. His body hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge was a message to other potential whistleblowers. Speak out and this is what happens. But it was also, inadvertently, a message to the public. Look what's being done in your name with your money by people and institutions you trust. The conspiracy that killed Roberto Calvi wanted to hide the truth. Instead, his death exposed more than his testimony ever could have. Listen to the rain falling on the Thames. Picture Blackfriars Bridge at dawn, the grey water flowing beneath, the old stones that have witnessed so much of London's history. Somewhere in that river, somewhere in those stones, the truth of what happened to Roberto Calvi on the night of June 17, 1982, remains hidden. We know he was murdered. We know it involved conspiracy between multiple parties with different but overlapping motives. We know the mafia wanted their money back and wanted to punish him for losing it. We know P2 needed to ensure he couldn't expose their secrets. We know the Vatican had every reason to want him silenced before he could testify about their financial crimes. But we don't know exactly who strangled him, who transported his body to the bridge, who positioned it so carefully beneath the scaffolding. We don't know if those who gave the orders faced any real consequences. We don't know how many other secrets died with Roberto Calvi that night. His case remains officially unsolved. The killers were never convicted. The conspiracy was never fully exposed. Justice, in the traditional sense, was never achieved. But perhaps there's another kind of justice in how the case has refused to be forgotten. How new evidence continues to emerge decades later. How researchers and journalists continue to investigate. How the Calvi family never gave up their quest for truth. Roberto Calvi's story is a reminder that powerful people and institutions can commit terrible crimes and escape punishment, at least in this life. But it's also a reminder that truth has a way of seeping out eventually, like water through cracks in old stones, patient and persistent and ultimately impossible to contain completely. The rain still falls on Blackfriars Bridge. The Thames still flows to the sea. And somewhere in the evidence, in the documents, in the testimony of those who know more than they've said, the full truth waits. Maybe someday someone will finally bring it to light. Until then, we remember Roberto Calvi, God's banker, the man who knew too much, who served too many masters, who discovered too late that in the world he'd chosen to inhabit, loyalty runs only one direction, and the price of betrayal or even just inconvenience is death beneath a bridge in the rain. If this story has kept you company through the night, if you found it helpful for sleep or simply fascinating, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and share it with anyone interested in true crime, unsolved mysteries, and the dark side of institutional power. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on who you think killed Roberto Calvi and why. And remember, the most interesting stories are often the ones that remain unfinished, the mysteries that refuse to be solved, the questions that continue to haunt us long after the rain has stopped falling. Thank you for listening. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next investigation. Eliot Ness was untouchable. That's what everyone said. The man who took down Al Capone, the incorruptible federal agent who'd become America's most famous lawman, arrived in Cleveland, Ohio in 1935 as the city's new safety director with a reputation that preceded him like thunder. He was 32 years old, handsome, brilliant, and utterly confident in his abilities. Cleveland welcomed him as a savior, a man who would clean up their corrupt police force and bring order to a city drowning in crime and economic depression. But Cleveland had a secret waiting for Eliot Ness, a nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A killer so cunning, so brutal, so careful that even the great Eliot Ness couldn't catch him. This is the story of the Cleveland Torso Murderer, a serial killer who dismembered at least 12 victims, possibly more, and was never caught. This is the story of how America's greatest detective met his match in a killer who understood one simple truth: the dead can't talk, but dismembered bodies scream in their silence. And this nightmare began on a warm September afternoon in 1935, in a place called Kingsbury Run, where two boys would make a discovery that would unleash one of the most terrifying murder investigations in American history. September 23, 1935, two teenage boys, James Wagner and Peter Kostura, were walking through Kingsbury Run, a Depression-era shantytown built in a ravine on Cleveland's east side. It was where the homeless lived in makeshift shelters, where the unemployed gathered around barrel fires, where decent people didn't go after dark. The boys were looking for scrap metal they could sell. Instead, they found a body, or rather what was left of one. At the bottom of a gully, partially hidden by weeds, lay a nude male torso. No head, no arms, no legs, just a torso, the cuts so precise they looked almost surgical. The body had been dead for weeks, possibly months, the flesh partially decomposed and preserved by chemicals that would later be identified as some kind of preservative. The boys ran screaming to find a police officer. Within hours, Kingsbury Run was swarming with cops. And that's when they found the second body. 30 feet away, buried in a shallow grave, was another torso. This one was headless as well, the limbs removed with the same disturbing precision. Two bodies, both male. Both dismembered with what the coroner would later describe as expert anatomical knowledge. Both completely unidentifiable without heads or fingerprints. The press went wild. Headlines screamed about the mad butcher of Kingsbury Run. But the police had nothing. No witnesses, no suspects, no leads. Just two nameless victims and a killer who knew exactly how to make identification impossible. When Eliot Ness arrived in Cleveland 2 months after those first bodies were found, the case was already going cold. The police had investigated, interviewed dozens of shantytown residents, searched the area thoroughly, and come up empty. Ness had bigger concerns. He was busy cleaning house at the police department, firing corrupt cops, reorganizing the force, making enemies among the old guard who resented this young outsider telling them how to do their jobs. The Torso murders were a local matter, a couple of dead transients, probably killed by another vagrant in some dispute that would never be solved. That's what Ness thought initially. That's what everyone thought. They were wrong. On January 26, 1936, 4 months after the first discovery, a woman walking her dog in a lot behind a butcher shop found a burlap bag. Inside were parts of a woman, an arm, torso, portions of legs, all carefully wrapped, all showing those same precise cuts. 2 weeks later, more parts were found scattered around the area. The head was discovered in a different location, partially buried. When they finally assembled all the pieces, they realized this was victim number 3. A woman this time, estimated to be around 40 years old. And then the killer went quiet. Months passed. Ness focused on his war against organized crime and police corruption. But the investigation into the Torso murders remained open, the files sitting on a detective's desk like a ticking time bomb, because the killer wasn't done. He was just getting started. June 5, 1936. A teenage boy hunting for minnows near Kingsbury Run found a pair of pants rolled into a bundle. Inside was a severed head. It belonged to a man, and the features were intact enough for identification. Finally, after 3 victims, they had a name: Edward Andrassy, a 28-year-old hospital orderly with a wife and a history of petty crime. The rest of Andrassy's body was found nearby, dismembered in the now familiar pattern. But there was something different about this victim. His genital area had been mutilated after death, and chemical tests showed he'd been alive when the dismemberment began. He'd been tortured. 3 days later, another body surfaced. This time just a torso and upper legs, found floating in Kingsbury Run's stagnant pools. Victim number 5, male, never identified, dismembered with the same precision. The press was in a frenzy. The mayor was demanding answers. And Eliot Ness, the famous crime fighter, found himself facing a challenge unlike any he'd encountered before. This wasn't like catching bootleggers or corrupt cops. This was hunting a ghost, a killer who left no witnesses, no evidence, nothing but silent, dismembered corpses that couldn't tell their stories. Ness assembled a special task force. Detectives Peter Merylo and Martin Zalewski were assigned to the case full-time. They began reviewing the evidence, looking for patterns, trying to build a profile of the killer. What they discovered was chilling. Detective Merylo was a bulldog of a cop, obsessive and relentless. He spent months studying the autopsy reports, visiting the dump sites, trying to understand the mind of the killer. What he found suggested a methodical, intelligent predator operating with disturbing precision. First, the killer selected victims from society's margins. Transients, prostitutes, people who wouldn't be immediately missed, people whose disappearance might never be reported. Second, the murders took place somewhere private, somewhere the killer could work undisturbed. The bodies were killed elsewhere and dumped in Kingsbury Run, never murdered at the location where they were found. Third, the dismemberment showed anatomical knowledge. The cuts were made at joints, the organs removed with care, the blood drained completely. Someone who knew human anatomy, possibly a doctor or butcher or someone with medical training. Fourth, the killer used chemicals to preserve some bodies, delaying decomposition and making time of death harder to determine. This suggested planning, preparation, access to preservatives. Fifth, and most disturbing, there were signs of torture on some victims. The killer didn't just murder them. He kept them alive, working on them, taking his time. Detective Zalewski focused on the psychological profile. What kind of person could do this? The answer was terrifying. Someone intelligent, organized, patient, and completely devoid of empathy. Someone who viewed human beings as objects, as materials to work with. Someone who was probably living a normal life, holding down a job, interacting with neighbors, while secretly conducting these horrific murders in some hidden location. Where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. If you're fascinated by unsolved mysteries and true crime, hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and turn on notifications because this case gets even darker. Now let's continue. July 22nd, 1936. Another victim. This time in the Big Creek area, miles from Kingsbury Run. A decapitated male torso, partially buried. Victim number 6. September 10th, 1936. The severed upper torso of a man was found in Kingsbury Run. Victim number 7. February 23rd, 1937. The upper part of a female torso washed up on the beach at East 30th Street. Victim number 8. A woman, dismembered with the same precision, dumped in Lake Erie. June 6, 1937. The decomposed lower torso of a woman floated to the surface under the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge. Victim number 9. The city was in panic. Cleveland's newspapers ran daily updates. Citizens were terrified. The shantytown residents of Kingsbury Run lived in constant fear, sleeping in groups, arming themselves with whatever they could find. And Eliot Ness was under enormous pressure. The man who'd taken down Capone couldn't catch a killer operating in his own city. The press started to turn on him. Editorial cartoons showed Ness chasing his own shadow while bodies piled up. Political enemies questioned whether the famous G-Man was out of his depth. But Ness didn't give up. He threw everything at the investigation. He ordered police to raid every shantytown, interview every transient, search every abandoned building in a 10-mile radius. He brought in experts from across the country. He personally visited crime scenes, studied the evidence, tried to find the connection. Nothing worked. The killer was too careful, too smart, too invisible. And then, on July 6, 1937, something changed. The killer made his first mistake. A woman stumbled into a police station, hysterical and barely coherent. Her name was later withheld from public records, but her story was documented in detail by investigators. She claimed she'd been picked up by a man offering her money and a place to stay. She was homeless, desperate, and she accepted. He took her to a building, she couldn't remember where. She'd been drinking heavily. The man gave her more alcohol, and that's when things got strange. She woke up on a table. She was naked. The man was there, wearing a butcher's apron, sharpening knives. He had a doctor's bag filled with surgical instruments. She screamed and fought. Somehow, in the struggle, she managed to break free and run. She fled through a door, downstairs, into the street, naked and terrified. She ran until she found the police station. The police tried to get her to lead them back to the location. But she couldn't remember. The alcohol, the trauma, the terror had wiped her memory. She could only describe the man in vague terms. Middle-aged, strong, well-dressed, spoke well, had soft hands. Detective Merillo believed her story completely. This fit the profile. The killer had kept her alive, prepared to work on her, and she'd escaped only through sheer luck. But without a location or a better description, they still had nothing solid. The woman disappeared shortly after giving her statement, probably too terrified to stay in Cleveland. She was never heard from again, and the killer, having lost a victim for the first time, seemed to grow even bolder. August 16, 1937. 2 burlap bags were found in the Cuyahoga River. Inside were the remains of victim number 10, a male, dismembered with increasing brutality. The coroner noted that the victim had been alive during the dismemberment. He'd been conscious, aware, suffering. April 8, 1938. A woman's leg was found floating in the river. Over the next few days, more parts surfaced. Victim number 11. A woman, her body scattered across multiple locations as if the killer was playing a game, seeing how far he could spread the evidence. What terrified investigators was the increasing frequency and the growing brutality. The killer was escalating. The torture was becoming more extreme, the dismemberment more violent. And there was something else. The dump sites were getting closer to the heart of the city, closer to wealthy neighborhoods, as if the killer was taunting the police, saying, "I can do this anywhere, and you still can't stop me." Eliot Ness was consumed by the case now. It had become personal. His reputation, his entire career, was being measured against his failure to catch this killer. He worked 18-hour days, chain-smoking and barely sleeping, reviewing evidence, chasing leads that went nowhere. He brought in psychologists to profile the killer. He consulted with FBI agents, with forensic experts, with anyone who might offer a fresh perspective. And then Ness did something desperate, something controversial, something that would haunt his legacy for the rest of his life. August 18, 1938. At 2 a.m., Eliot Ness led a massive police raid on the shantytown in Kingsbury Run. Over 100 officers descended on the area with torches and bulldozers. They arrested every transient they found, over 60 people. They burned the shanties to the ground, destroying the entire settlement. Ness's reasoning was twofold. First, he believed the killer was finding victims in the shantytown, and by dispersing the population, he'd remove the hunting ground. Second, he hoped the raid would shake something loose, that someone might have seen something or know something, and the shock of the raid would make them talk. The raid was brutal and widely condemned. Civil rights groups protested. The press called it a violation of the poor's basic rights. The homeless had nowhere to go, scattered across the city, many arrested on vagrancy charges. And the worst part? It didn't work. The killer didn't stop. On August 16, 1939, exactly 1 year after the raid, the dismembered remains of victim number 12 were found. The torso was discovered in a dump near East 9th Street. The legs were found 10 miles away. The head was never recovered. It was as if the killer was making a point. You can burn down shanties. You can arrest transients. But you can't touch me. I'm still here. I'm still working. And you're still helpless to stop me. Eliot Ness's career in Cleveland was effectively over. Though he remained safety director until 1942, his reputation never recovered from the torso murders. The man who'd taken down Capone had been defeated by a killer who remained a shadow. But Ness never stopped investigating, even after he left office. In his private notes, discovered after his death, he identified a prime suspect, Dr. Francis Edward Sweeney. Sweeney was a surgeon who'd served in World War I and had performed amputations in field hospitals. He came from a prominent Cleveland family, had the medical knowledge to perform the dismemberments, and lived near several of the dump sites. But here's what made him truly suspicious. Sweeney had a history of violent behavior, alcoholism, and had been institutionalized multiple times for mental health issues. His ex-wife had reported that he'd threatened her with knives and talked about cutting people up. He lived in a building that had been investigated as a possible murder site. And he knew Eliot Ness personally. They'd met socially before the murders began. In 1938, Ness had Sweeney brought in for questioning. According to Ness's notes, he subjected Sweeney to a polygraph test that lasted for days, one of the longest interrogations in Cleveland history. Sweeney allegedly failed the polygraph repeatedly when asked about the murders. But here's the problem. Sweeney's family was politically connected. His cousin was a congressman. There was no physical evidence linking him to any crime scene, and polygraph results weren't admissible in court. Ness couldn't arrest him, couldn't charge him, couldn't publicly accuse him without proof. What Ness could do, allegedly, was make a deal. Shortly after the interrogation, Sweeney voluntarily committed himself to a veterans hospital, a mental institution where he would remain for the rest of his life. And the murders stopped. No more torso victims were found in Cleveland after 1938. Coincidence? Or confession through action? Make sure you're subscribed because we're about to dive into the theories and the evidence that still haunts investigators today. Hit that like button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Detective Merylo, who continued investigating the case even after Ness left Cleveland, was convinced Sweeney was the killer. The evidence, while circumstantial, was compelling. Sweeney lived at 2014 Scoville Avenue, right next to Kingsbury Run. He had access to a private lab where he could work undisturbed. As a doctor, he had both the anatomical knowledge and the tools needed for the dismemberments. He fit the psychological profile: intelligent, organized, able to maintain a normal facade while harboring violent impulses. His medical discharge papers from World War I indicated he'd suffered from what was then called shell shock, now known as PTSD, and had shown signs of psychopathy. Former colleagues reported that Sweeney had an unusual fascination with human anatomy, that he'd made inappropriate comments about dissection and cutting. One nurse claimed he'd once joked about practicing on cadavers in ways that weren't medically necessary. His timeline matched perfectly. He was in Cleveland for all 12 murders. After his institutionalization in 1938, the Cleveland murders stopped completely. Some investigators believed the murder count was actually higher. There were similar unsolved dismemberment cases in Pennsylvania and Ohio dating back to 1923 and continuing into the 1950s. All bore the same hallmarks: precise cuts, complete dismemberment, victims from marginalized populations. Sweeney had moved around during those years, and his whereabouts often coincided with the locations and timing of these other murders. But without concrete evidence, without a confession, without physical proof linking him to even one victim, Sweeney remained only a suspect. A very likely suspect, but still just a theory. Not everyone believed Sweeney was the killer. Over the decades, other theories emerged. Some investigators thought there were actually two killers working independently or together. The variation in dump sites, the differences in preservation methods, the inconsistencies in the mutilation patterns suggested possibly different perpetrators. Others pointed to Frank Dolezal, a bricklayer who was arrested in 1939 after one victim, Flo Polillo, was found to have lived in his building. Dolezal was interrogated brutally by police and allegedly confessed, though he later recanted. He died in jail under suspicious circumstances, possibly murdered, possibly suicide, before trial. But the murders continued after his death, suggesting he wasn't the killer or wasn't the only one. Some theorists believed the killer might have been a woman. The precision of the cuts, the seeming lack of sexual assault on many victims, and the ability to lure victims without suspicion could point to a female killer, possibly a nurse or midwife. There was even a theory that the killer was a mortician or someone who worked in the death industry, someone who had regular access to bodies and embalming chemicals, someone for whom dismemberment was a professional skill. And then there were the truly wild theories, that it was a satanic cult, that it was organized crime sending messages through the bodies, that it was a conspiracy involving multiple people in positions of power. But the simplest explanation remained the most likely. One killer, someone with medical knowledge, someone organized and patient, someone who stopped when the heat got too intense, someone exactly like Dr. Francis Sweeney. Eliot Ness left Cleveland in 1942, his reputation tarnished by both the unsolved Torso murders and a drunk driving accident that had injured a young man. He moved to Washington, D.C., then to Pennsylvania, working various security jobs, never again achieving the fame and success he'd had as a young agent. But he never stopped thinking about the Torso murders.